Hello, everybody, and welcome. On behalf of the International Career Development Peak Body Network, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome you to this webinar from wherever you're joining us across the world this afternoon, Australian time, but obviously different time zones. My name is David Carney. I'm the Executive Director of the Career Industry Council of Australia, and it gives CICA a great deal of pleasure to be hosting this particular webinar, the second webinar in the Think Tank webinar series. Before we get underway, I'd just like to make an acknowledgement of country. So the Career Industry Council of Australia would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this particular webinar from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, or in fact any First Nations peoples across the globe who are joining us for this particular webinar. Just a couple of quick little housekeeping just to let you know that this session is being recorded. If you do experience any technical issues through the course of the next hour, we just ask you to try refreshing your screen in the first instance. If that doesn't work, you are able to log out and log back into the session. If you do experience some major technical issues, you will receive a copy of the recording tomorrow. We do have the chat function open for you throughout the course of this particular session, so we would encourage you to contribute your discussion and comments as you listen to our speakers. Just to let you know, though, that the chat function is just for sort of discussion amongst attendees. If you have any specific questions for any of our presenters today, we would ask you to use the Q&A button to put those questions in. You can either put them in throughout the session or towards the end. That's it for the housekeeping. So I'd now like to introduce Dr. Mary McMahon, who is going to be chairing this particular session for us. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, David, for your introduction. And as David said, I welcome to this International Think Tank webinar series. I'm the Vice President of the Career Industry Council of Australia, and I'm pleased to be chairing this webinar today on behalf of the International Career Development Peak Body Network. So who is this network that has appeared on the scene? Basically, in 2020, when COVID was hitting its straps, the Career Industry Council began thinking about the post-COVID recovery and career development's role in the post-COVID recovery. And as the peak body for the Australian career industry, began to wonder if other national peak bodies were also debating the same issues. And so CICA initiated a meeting with other peak bodies. So the Career Development Institute from England, the Canadian Career Development Foundation, the Career Development Association of New Zealand and the South African Career Development Association, to begin discussions with them about what the issues were in the COVID world and what they could be perhaps in the post-COVID recovery. And one of the things that the peak body group decided to do was to provide support for practitioners. And so we thought that this think tank webinar series that is designed around symposia with highly regarded international speakers would be a way to do that on some topics of broad interest to people around the world. So basically we decided that we would run 5 of these webinars through 2021 and 2022. So the topics are listed there. We began earlier in the year with who we are as a profession, considering the issues of professionalisation. This webinar today focuses on theory and practice, and we've got 3 planned for next year on policy and political climate, equality, diversity and inclusion, and social justice and advocacy. So today's focus, though, is on career theory and practice. And as you know, career theory provides a foundation for the field. It provides a foundation for the work that we do every day with our clients, because it offers explanations of career development and career decision making. And these explanations have been offered for more than 100 years And probably the earliest and most recognised of those explanations, if you like, is that of Parsons in his book, Choosing a Vocation, when he proposed a model of career decision-making based on knowing yourself, knowing about the world of work, and putting those two sets of information together with a view to making a sound decision. So that model or that theory has underpinned our field since that time. But since that time, a multitude of theories have been developed, and sometimes that can be quite confusing for people just beginning in the field. So you'll know about some of the long-standing theories in our field, like those of Super and Holland and Krumboltz that were developed in the middle of the 20th century. And some of you will know about more contemporary theories such as social cognitive career theory, chaos theory, systems theory, framework of career development. And basically, theory should be able to underpin practice. Practitioners should be using theory to underpin their work. But one of the issues about theory is it's developed in the context of time and place. So when it's applied beyond that original context and time, there can be challenges that face that. So basically, that in a nutshell is what our three presenters will be covering today. So our three presenters today are Professor Emeritus Wendy Patton from Queensland University of Technology in Australia, Professor Nancy Arthur from the University of South Australia, and Dr. Gideon Arulmani from the Promise Foundation in India. So I'll introduce each of our speakers a little more fully just prior to their presentation. But I'm very pleased that they've agreed to join us today, and I think that we're very honoured to have such expertise to guide us through this webinar. So our first speaker today is Professor Wendy Patton from Queensland University of Technology, and Wendy's going to be talking about career theory. Professor Patton has published extensively in the area of career development, and she's currently on the editorial boards for a number of national and international journals. And she's the founding editor of The Sense, which has now changed to Brill, publishes career development series. And her most recent publications have been in 2019, A History of Career Development in Australia, which is a wonderful contribution to our field, and the fourth edition of her co-authored book on career development and systems theory. So I don't know of anybody who's written more about theory in general than Wendy, so she's a great person to lead off our think tank webinar today. So I'll hand over to you, Wendy.
Thanks very much, Mary. I really appreciate being part of this series of webinars. I think it's a wonderful contribution that's going to help a lot of people who aren't able to be attending conferences at the moment. So my focus is looking at career theory and focusing on that paradox of stasis and change. And Mary's talked a little bit about how important theories are to our work. Thanks, Mary. So as Mary indicated, theory provides broad perspectives on career development influences and contexts. And there have been there is a long history of a number of theories being developed, but it's very clear that when you're looking at a lot of those, that they have been developed within time and context. I think about Holland and Super, very much related to post-World War II and the kinds of needs that were present then in terms of understanding people's career development. But more recently, and I say more recently, I guess it's probably 10 to 20 years, there have been significant critiques around the relevance of theories that we have, around their appropriateness and around their applicability. One of the areas that I'm going to focus on is, as I said, the paradox. And while we have a number of emerging theories, traditional theories tend to remain the basis of many texts. Thanks, Mary. So the representations of theories, interestingly, from the 1990 book by Sam Ossipau, where he focused on Holland, Super, Dawson, Lofquist, the theory of work adjustment, and the work of Krumboltz. In 1994, a book talked about the real big five in theories and talked about well, you can see them on the screen. I don't need to repeat them. In 1996, the Brown and Brooks text on career theories focused on Holland, Dawson, Lofquist, Super, Gottfriedson, Krumboltz, and had then introduced the Lent et al. Work, Peterson et al. Work, Young et al. Work, and the work by Brown on values. But this representation of limited theories has continued. Thanks, Mary. The Brown and Brooks 2002 book had those theories that you can see listed there, and had added some of them. So had added the Gottfriedson work, had added the Savickas work, which is where Savickas was starting to, I guess, introduce career construction theory as an extension of Super's work. In 2008, Leung talked again about the Big Five, Dawson, Lofquist, the theory of work adjustment, Super, and I include Savickas there in terms of his advancement of that work, Gottfriedson, Lent et al. And Holland. In 2005, Brown and Lent, you can see there the theories that they included in that text. And then their 2013 and 2021 representations of that text basically had the same sort of theories, same list of theories, but in their 2021 edition added Bluestein's psychology of working theory. Thanks, Mary. These representations do omit those theories which have established and practical support, and very many of the what we might call emerging theories, but for some of them, they've been around for some time, and I'll illustrate that in a moment. A number of theories, for example, the cognitive information processing theory has an extensive history and extensive published work around its practicality, both its theoretical application, but also its practicality. But again, it has not had an advancement in some of these texts. The systems theory framework, which Mary and I first published in 1995, was derived from constructivism and social constructionism, and was one of the first theoretical formulations to actually focus on that in the careers field. But we also talked about the integration of theories. And I'm going to refer to a couple of my most recent chapters that I wrote in the books by Athanasio and Van Esbroek, and then Harsha Pereira and Jim Athanasio in 2019. In 2008, I talked about career construction theory and systems theory framework as the two theories that were really focusing on constructivism and social constructivism. In 2019, I extended those two theories to 6, and I actually talked about the importance that they also provided some kind of bridging or integrative framework. Thanks, Mary. And while I call this slide newly developed theoretical formulations, I also have added in terms of when these theories actually have been published. So to actually talk about them newly developed, some of them have been in place now for more than 2 decades. So the psychology of working framework, Bluestein and related publications, and more recently, the conceptualization of the psychology of working theory. It's derived from constructivism and social constructionism, and it provides some integrative framework. Career construction theory, Savickas' work, which has advanced the work of Super. Again, he first published around 2001, and this also could certainly be called as a theory that talks about integration and has that strong influence of constructivism and social constructionism. The system theory framework, very strongly a framework, an integrative framework, and we have just published the 4th edition of the key text in that work, but we first published that work in 1995. Thanks, Mary. The chaos theory of careers, Pryor and Bright, again, Australian authors, and they have published extensively. And again, that's very much an integrative framework and very derived from constructivism and social constructionism. And their work was first published in 2003. More recently, the Living Systems Theory of Vocational Behaviour and Development, it's a mouthful, published by Vondracek, Ford and Porfelli, 2014-2019. And while that's their first full theoretical development The early work was actually published in a book by Vondracek, Leder and Schulenberg in 1986 called Career Development, A Lifespan Developmental Perspective. So again, while that's a recent conceptualization that's been published, the early work was very much developed in the mid-1980s. And finally, contextual action theory, a number of references there, but that was first published in 1996 by Richard Young, Ladislav Velach, and Audrey Collin. So while these are often talked about as newly emerging, and I talk about them in that way, it's very much so that they have been in the field for some time. Thanks, Mary. Part of the challenge is this paradigm divide. And we can see here that constructivist work and constructivist theories and constructivist practice based on those theories is individualized, is less customized, is creative and nonlinear. And the positivist theories and the work related to those is very much counsellor directive in terms of their approaches, routinized versus creative and very linear. This divide, I think, has been exacerbated by the limited attention to some of the newer theories in what I call some of the traditional texts. Thanks, Mary. So in an attempt to try to look at why this paradox and this divide is still very much a part of our field, Vondracek, Ford and Puffelli commented that current theories of career development have had almost no impact beyond the boundaries of a few relatively small subspecialities in the social and behavioural sciences. They talk about the notion that each theory has only focused on some relevant attributes. Collectively, career theories have not been linked to advances in related fields, like, for example, the work in systems theory in developmental systems. Most theories have focused narrowly on individuals' perspectives, and some have failed to demonstrate relevance and usefulness to practitioners. And I know Nancy and Gideon will talk further about those. Thanks, Mary. These authors argued that for vocational psychology to assume a stronger place, the various disciplines who lay claims to aspects of this domain need to look beyond their current theoretical, scientific, and professional boundaries and to endeavour to integrate and claim their place in the larger science of understanding human functioning and development and promoting positive development across the lifespan. Thanks, Mary. In 2019, I tried to, again, myself have a look at why sometimes promising integrative frameworks from more than 50 years ago, for example, there was one written by Blau et al. In 1956, did not receive traction in the field, and there've been more than that one by Blau. My sense of the reasons is one, the proliferation of career theories after World War II, and I again refer to the early work of Holland, Super and Krumboltz. The dominance of psychology as the disciplinary underpinning of these theories, and the very late inclusion of constructivism and social constructionism into vocational psychology, despite their inclusion into related fields earlier than this. Thanks, Mary. So what of the future in career theory? What we know is there needs to be a greater emphasis on contexts and cultural diversities. There needs to be a greater focus on self-construction or development, and a greater emphasis around constructivism. Thanks, Mary. Equally, theories relevant to an increasingly uncertain future need to be adopted or need to be modified. There needs to be a constructivist, person-centred approach to understanding career behaviour. We need to embrace the diversity of context and diversity of individuals, and also the diversity of possible experience. Thanks, Mary. To address the critiques of Mary and myself in our work and Vondracek et al., career theories need to demonstrate an openness to learnings from related theories, to embrace a larger number of related discipline specialities, for example, economics and sociology, and provide a broad picture of the individual in context, singularly and plurally. I like this quote here from Vondracek and Puffelli. Quitting the pursuit of human truth because it is too complex or obscured would be a tragic failure of counselling and vocational psychology. Theoretical formulations that come ever closer to the true complexity of the world and the varying perspectives that humans share continue to be sought. And I think that's a challenge that I'd like to leave everybody with for our pursuit in the field of career theory. Thanks, Mary. Finally, I've just included 4 references here. So the 3 top ones are the ones that refer specifically where I've derived from those 3 chapters of mine, but I've also included the 4th edition of the Career Development Systems Theory book that just came out a couple of months ago, because that is, I believe, the most comprehensive review of career theory currently that exists, but also it does address the applicability of the systems theory framework to a range of practice contexts, for example, counselling, career education and research. So that final reference, Patton and Lamar 2021, you'll find all the references from those that I've sourced in my presentation in that book. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you found that useful. Thanks, Mary.
Sorry, I was muted. I was saying thanks very much, Wendy, and thank you for your presentation. We'll come back. I noticed there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, and we'll pick up on those questions at the end after we've heard all 3 speakers. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce Professor Nancy Arthur. So Nancy, if you want to set up your screen, that would be good. Professor Nancy Arthur is currently appointed as Dean of Research for the University of South Australia Business, and previously held the role of Dean, Research and Innovation in the Division of Arts, Education and Social Sciences in Calgary in Canada. So we're very pleased that Nancy has come to join us in Australia, and we've welcomed her contribution here since she's been here. Nancy's research focuses on how professionals respond to global forces in their work environment and how they incorporate diversity and social justice into their roles and responsibilities. And her current research focuses on career development and international transition of students and workers. Nancy's a registered psychologist in Alberta, Canada, and a fellow of the Canadian Psychological Association. And her recent edited books include Counselling in Context, Identities and Social Justice, Contemporary Theories of Career Development, International Perspectives, and a book on career theory, an edited book on career theories and models, and how those theories and models underpin practice. So a lot of Nancy's recent work has been thinking about the application of theory to practice. So she's a very good person to lead us through this second presentation in the webinar. Thanks, Nancy.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, and I want to offer a warm welcome to colleagues and friends who are joining the webinar today from many countries. I'm joining you from Adelaide, Australia today, and I also want to say what a pleasure it is to be on a panel with my colleagues Mary, Wendy, and Gideon to share some ideas about career theory and practice. Now, if I was giving this presentation even 10 years ago, I might have titled it Career Theory and Practice, Bridging the Great Divide. Indeed, when I was learning about theory many years ago, I struggled with the writing about career theory. It was often difficult to understand. It was often complex. I was often left wondering how to apply theories in practice. And as an instructor who has worked directly with students in credit courses, but also training practitioners in the field of career practice, I've heard their concerns as well, that they often find theory difficult to consume and have not felt confident about making the connections between theory and practice. I think sometimes there's been concern that what is popular in our field is actually not always grounded in theory. And that's a comment about technique-based practice as opposed to a practice that is grounded in theory. Well, moving forward, I think we've had many advances in our field that give us a lot of hope and give us a lot of solid foundational information that we can use to connect theory and practice. So I just want to think about how we position career theory and practice, because as my opening comments suggest, there has been a disconnect between theory, where some people might be working only on theory or only on the practice in one camp or the other. But the time has come for us to really examine a better integration, a stronger integration between theory within practice. So my last point is moving forward, it's a time for us to be accountable and really borrow from some very, very exciting develops in the field around the integration of theory in practice. So why is this important? Well, it's important for career practitioners to consider the basis of their decisions, of their assessment, of their ways of working with clients and the public. So this quote suggests that it is a key responsibility. In fact, it's an ethical mandate. If we look at our professional standards, if we look at codes of ethics in multiple countries around the world, one of the core domains, often expressed as competency domains, has to do with knowledge, and that knowledge being accountable about where your knowledge is derived from. So this means that practitioners need to be equipped with contemporary sources of knowledge that informs their practice. So I just want to invite those of you who are joining us today to think of your relationship with career theory. Some reflection questions for you. How does career theory inform your practice? In what ways does it inform your practice? Which theories do you use? And when have you updated your knowledge? That doesn't necessarily mean you need to change theories, but to think about, have you read the most recent developments about the theories that you use? Because we're seeing some really exciting contemporary updates of theories that have been around for a long time, but we're also seeing new developments. Wendy gave us a lovely historical review of development theory, but we're seeing emerging models and newer theoretical developments that offer some really promising directions that are new and different, and also some that have integrated concepts from the past. So my last reflection question for you is to consider, how do you explore the theory practice connection? Does this come up in the ways that you are involved in case consultations, in the ways that you look at the interplay between theory, research, and practice to inform evidence base? Is it part of your planning days? Is it part of your professional development? There are multiple ways that we can build stronger theory practice connections. So I want to revisit some content here around how to make good choices about which career theory that you might use. So I've extrapolated some content from that's often talked about in what makes a good theory generally, and applying those principles to career theory. So I'm going to just briefly review 5 of them here. One is that the content of the theory is logical and consistent. In other words, you read it, it makes sense. It explains a phenomenon, it explains career-related behavior, or explains processes over time. Parsimony is a longer word that's meant to define that the theory should have as few concepts as possible. Longer and complexity is not necessarily desirable, but how is the theory organized with a few concepts, and are they easy to understand, and are they easy to understand together? Validity and scope, I've put those two together. Validity tends to be associated with more of a quantitative look, but it really is meant to ask the question, what is the coverage of this particular theory, and does it hold up? Is it broad coverage, or is it meant to be applied to a specific population or to specific questions? So how does it apply to the kinds of questions and the kinds of practice situations that you're interested in? The testability looks at the accuracy. Could we replicate that theory or the test of the theory across context and across situation? And has it offered value over time? Now, the purism is an interesting one. And just referring to the presentation that Wendy gave, we're seeing examples where some of our foundational theory has indeed informed the development of new theories and new perspectives that have been developed over the last couple of decades. So purism is about what kind of knowledge can be stimulated through new research and through new forms of practice. So these are 5, but what I really want to focus on here for the purpose of this presentation is utility, and what's the practical value of theory. Do you find it useful? So it's a shift from what is the content of the theory to how it is applied in practice, and where do we have practice examples and materials and products that help us to really understand how to apply that knowledge in practice applications. I'd like to highlight 2 projects that I was involved in to try to bridge that theory practice divide that I talked about early in the presentation. This is a project with Mary McMahon and Roberta Borgen. We invited theorists to take up the challenge of making their work more practical. So 43 chapters, each chapter with a different theory or model. And we asked the authors in Career Theories and Models at Work to provide a brief theoretical overview, really the bare minimum that they needed to talk about to explain their theory. They offered an original case vignette, analysis of the case vignette using the concepts of the theory, and then offered up to 10 practice points. The things that those chapter authors, many of them are the original theorists, from their opinion, what should practitioners know? What do they need to know to guide their practice? Now, those were what I've just described are the 6 sort of what I would call traditional ways to evaluate theory. But I want to focus on 2 more that I think are very important and critical for contemporary practice. The next one I want to talk about is application to cultural context. Theories are developed in a specific time and from the worldviews of the person or people who develop theory. And we have to ask the question about whether those underlying tenets, often underlying beliefs or values that are explicit or implicit in the theory, who do they apply to? Could there be one theory for everyone? And what's the capacity for us to be flexible or adaptable? Some people have argued, well, we can't develop a theory for every population, but we do need to examine the underlying tenets and underlying cultural values of our theories. Now, I've added another one that I'd like us to think about is given our contemporary world, we recognize that there are many people, and increasingly a divide between people who have access to education and access to sustainable and meaningful employment. So we might put a social justice lens on our theory. Some authors have been very explicit around concepts that relate to equity and equality and practice points that lead to social justice advocacy. But we do have to deconstruct theory to look at how well concepts resonate with people's lives and some of the systemic influences on their career development. The second project that I want to highlight is one in which we asked theorists to discuss the cultural applications of their work. Now, in many other projects and many other texts in the market, you'll see 1 or 2 lines or a paragraph. In this project, we asked that each chapter that there was explicit discussion of how well the authors felt that their work applied across cultural contexts. So in a detailed theoretical description, an original case study, and analysis, we took a look at what did they say about the cultural validity or applications. So the kinds of information that came through was looking at how their theory had been used or researched across diverse populations within a country and in multiple countries, adding international data to inform theory. Theories had been used in a variety of community settings and with a variety of people with social identity markers such as homelessness, persons with disabilities. Theories that have been used in a multitude of practice settings for program development in multiple countries, case studies and tools for practice that have been tested and implemented across cultural and country contexts. And other authors talked about the fact that to be careful that culture is not a commodity, but rather it is contained within the stories of clients and emerges within the relationships of practitioners. So the authors in this particular project, again, explicitly talked about how their theory addressed culture and more implicitly addressed through their theoretical conception and the applications they offered. So I just want to conclude with a couple of comments. You know, there are an abundance of theories that are available now to inform career development practices. And I think we're in a quite an exciting era when we do have choices around which theories we want to use. It's important we have criteria to make those selections. And it's also important that we continue to stimulate new developments, and particularly new developments from a multitude of countries, because the field has been dominated by Western perspectives. So let's use this as a call to revisit and refresh our understandings. Lastly, we've talked about the theory practice applications. Theories are tested through practice, and it's very important that we include the experiences of practitioners as an important source of information for further development of career theories. Thank you very much. I'll turn things over to you again, Mary. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nancy, and thank you for your really interesting presentation about the link between theory and practice. It's given us a lot to think about. Gideon, if you'd like to start sharing your slides now, and it gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce Dr. Gideon Al-Romani from the Promise Foundation, India. We've mentioned a couple of times in this webinar how theory is developed in context, and so Gideon is going to think about theory from a non-Western context. And Gideon is a clinical psychologist interested in culture and counselling, and he's developed a cultural preparation process model that's informed intervention in more than 30 countries. He's a founder and trustee of the Indian Association of Career and Livelihood Planning, and a board member of the IAEVG, and an international fellow of CICA, and a visiting professor at a number of universities. And he's consulted to the ILO, UNICEF, the World Bank, and other agencies. And he's published more than 75 papers in peer-reviewed journals and a number of book chapters, and he's given many keynote addresses around the world. And what you may not know about Gideon is that he's interested in craft, and Mauler is a company that he's works with that produces natural handcrafted jewellery and artefacts from found objects. And he has a passion for wine making on his small vineyard in India. So with that introduction, I'll hand over to you, Gideon, and thank you.
Thanks, Mary, for that introduction, and thanks to David also for organizing this webinar. A warm welcome to you from Bangalore, India, South India. It's wonderful to see so many of you in this seminar. Thanks again for having me. And thanks to Wendy and Nancy for giving us such a comprehensive overview, first of all, historically of theory. One second, yeah, of theory, and then to Nancy for bringing us once again to think about the connection between theory and practice. Now, coming in last, many of the concepts that Wendy and Nancy, I will repeat, and I think it's worthy of being repeated because they are so fundamental to both the generation of theory as well as building the link between theory and practice. Now, as Mary mentioned just now, my brief is to look at the non-Western context. And when you bring this dimension into what Wendy and Nancy spoke about, there are a number of issues that begin to surface. So I'd like to first of all spend a moment on reiterating what Wendy and Nancy said just now. So theory, what is it? And why do we need theory at all? We are practitioners. Why do we need to read all this stuff and break our heads over it? Why can't we just have an intervention, execute the intervention very nicely, and then it's all done? So why do we need theory? So theory, first of all, what is theory? A set of propositions aimed at explaining, describing, and predicting relationships between two or more concepts. And that's perhaps a very simple definition, but a comprehensive one. Now, why? Why do we need theory? Theory provides us a framework for observation. Otherwise, we are floating around in space, as it were, without actually knowing where we are going and why we are doing what we are doing as practitioners. Provides a framework. Very importantly, and this connects with the non-Western part, which I'll come to just now, theory provides us with a vocabulary to name what we observe, career development stages, or social cognitions, or career beliefs. We need names, we need labels with which we can understand a phenomenon. And so we have here the great, the first publications of The Origin of the Species and the Theory of Relativity. All of these are broad frameworks within which explaining, describing, and predicting can occur. Now, where do theories come from? This is a very critical point when we look at it from the non-Western perspective. Now, scientific theories make an attempt to empirically weave empirically proven facts together to give us this tapestry, give us this idea of why and how a certain phenomenon occurs. So that's the logical positivist approach. Experiments, proof, evidence. Yeah? But not everything can be observed in a randomized controlled trial. Not everything can be explained in terms of numbers and factor analysis. This, for example, for me, is a person who is a progenitor of theory. This lady whom I met, 82 years old, is a specialist in a certain form of craft in the Maldives. And when you speak to her, you begin to understand that personal, collective experience, accumulation of observations, intuition, trial and error, and socially mediated or constructed knowledge. All of these also are sources for us to consider when we're looking at theorizing and theories. Now, the relevance of theories. Theories emerge from context. That has come through very strongly both in Wendy and Nancy's presentation. Theories come from contexts, and contexts have multiple dimensions. There's a physical dimension, for example. There's a historical dimension. There's a socio-cultural and a psychosocial dimension to the context in which theories are born. Going back to the same picture again, this is the material this lady weaves, and you can see it's part of Maldivian culture. It's worn by young people, and it's a sign of reaching adulthood, reaching maturation. And you can see there is theory here. There is a certain kind of material that's to be used. There's a certain way in which this beautiful embroidery is made. So there's a physical, historical, socio-cultural, and psychosocial context. The relevance of theory, as the others have mentioned, the relevance of theory is closely connected to its coherence with the history, values, and beliefs of a people. Moving on, staying on the theme of theory and context. Now, we know most contemporary theories of guidance and counseling have emerged from the West. They're a success because they are created by members of a particular culture in response to needs expressed within that culture. And these approaches were in effect developed by a people, Carl Rogers or Donald Super, by a people, for a people with certain cultural orientation. So most theories have a strong cultural coloring. Now, both the creators and consumers of these theories have been culturally prepared in a similar manner to offer and partake of this service. Yeah, so, for example, speaking to someone about your issues is a culturally mediated phenomenon. In certain cultures, you don't speak about your deep emotions and feelings. They share a similar vocabulary of values and cherish a particular approach to life. And therefore, Carl Rogers was driven actually to say that there are necessary and sufficient. Sufficient is where I have a problem. Yeah, necessary perhaps, but sufficient conditions, yeah, it really makes me wonder. Now, the key point, and it makes me wonder because of pictures like this. So you can see here, this is career development. Father, master teaching the son, elder person teaching a younger person. This is a picture from North India, and this is a picture from Northeast India. And when you extrapolate from here, the key point to be noted is that the same conditions may neither be necessary nor sufficient for people from a different cultural heritage. A theory that's individualistic in its orientation, for example. Most Western theories come from an individualistic cultural context, so they place the person, the individual, at the center of the stage. But if it's a culture like this, it's not the individual who's at the center of the stage, it is the family, the community. Cultures that are intuitive, experiential, community and family oriented would have difficulties in connecting with individualistically oriented theories. Just very quickly to run through, if you take Holland, for example, Nancy mentioned Holland earlier on, when Leon and his colleagues investigated Holland in India, they found that Holland did not connect with ways of thinking in India. The vocational preference inventory, for example, the list of occupations that come up have a caste implication in this culture, in the Indian culture. And certain careers are considered too low. You cannot say to a middle-class family in India, why don't you think of your son in terms of being a plumber or a carpenter or a mason? No way. Yeah, certain careers are considered too low, and therefore Holland fails in a context outside which he intended his ideas to be put into place. The development and lifespan approaches. Wendy mentioned this earlier on. Now, these theories provide a very valuable framework and ideas of stages, tasks, career maturity. All of this are very useful to understand career development. However, an important limitation, particularly when you look at it from the non-Western perspective, is that the individual and contextual factors that influence career development are often not addressed. There are historical factors, there are cultural factors, all of which contribute to the manner in which stages play out and tasks come up in the mindset of a person, and the way career maturity can actually influence career choice. Now, if you take the idea of readiness, for example, readiness juxtaposed with tasks, what the developmentalists speak about, very helpful, very useful. But when they say that career development keeps pace with cognitive maturation, we have a difficulty because cultural factors are what actually influence the playing out of the way in which tasks are resolved. So there are a whole lot of non-normative factors that could influence career development. Social cognitive theories, self-efficacy, performance accomplishments, Bandura's work, John Trumbull's work, vicarious experience, all of these, again, very useful, very helpful constructs, but they need to be re-examined and reinterpreted to see how they interact with each other, what their sources are, what their cultural sources are, and how that shapes, for example, social cognitions, and this would vary across context and culture. Now, we've often spoken about adapting. Now, adaptation ought to go much beyond literal translations, because A culture is a powerful mediating factor, and it's quite possible that a certain concept or a construct from Holland or Super or Bluestein is unfamiliar and considered strange and perhaps even unacceptable in a culture for which the translation is being undertaken. So language becomes a very powerful mediating factor when you bring in non-Western contexts. Now, these critiques are to be addressed. A fundamental epistemological shift that is required, perhaps, is to examine existing theory from the subjectivist viewpoint rather than the objectivist viewpoint. Yeah? When you look, if you remember those pictures of the old lady and the families working together, it emerges from within. On the other hand, when you're objectivist about it, a disconnect can occur when you bring other cultures into the picture. Now, what is our objective? Our objective is not to say the Indian way or the Japanese way or the Australian way is better than the other. That's not the intention at all. The intention is to set aside these assumptions and acknowledge that a given culture has already been prepared in a certain way over ages of time, aeons of time, to engage with life. Now, the moment we begin to acknowledge that knowledge exists already, theories exist already in almost all cultures, then we are starting to move toward blending observations with the generation of theory. I'd like to conclude with this statement. The urgent need, therefore, is to look for bridges. I think the theme that comes through both in Nancy's and Wendy's presentation is this question, the need for bridging. The urgent need is to look for bridges between epistemologies, keeping the felt need in focus. What is it that our audiences actually want? So therefore, to move from practice to theory, for me, is an important objective. Thank you. I'll leave it there and hand it back to Mary. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Gideon, for your presentation. It's stimulated, as have the previous two presentations, a lot of comment in the chat box and in the questions. So we've got just a few minutes left, and I've been monitoring the questions, and I think we've got time for a question to each of you. So first of all, Wendy, a question to you from Phoenix about the constructivist theory being characterized as individualized and less customized. She's asking, are these contradictory? And she would like an explanation if possible. So can you elaborate briefly for Phoenix? It relates to one of your earlier slides.
Sorry. Sorry, thanks, Mary. Look, I don't think they're contradictory. I think they're actually saying a very similar thing. I think we're talking about constructivist theories having an individualized, and I'd say perhaps even contextualized, following on from what Gideon was saying, understanding about the influences relevant to each individual. And in working with people with that constructivist basis, you would have a less customized approach to how you went about your practice. So that would be my response to that, Mary.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. And a question, I think, possibly to you, Nancy, this one. This Tracy is asking, as a seasoned practitioner of over 25 years, I often describe my practice as being influenced by multiple career theories. And she's asking how many practitioners would subscribe to only one or two theories.
Oh, that's a great question, because it's a question about, how do we choose, and do we stay loyal to one theory over time? What I've really tried to advocate is, particularly for people new to the field, is they try to gain a really strong grounding in one or two theoretical orientations, and then build their repertoire, knowledge, and toolkits of practice that stem from those as they go. So some people are, I don't know a number. Some people really stay very close to some of the original theories that they learned early in their careers. Other people tend to bring together different concepts and approaches across a bit more of an eclectic. What matters most is I think that we're able to trace back some of our practice ideas to say they're supportable by knowledge and by research. So what I also just really encourage is for everybody to take a look at what's in the field now, because you might enjoy an update to the theory that you've stayed loyal to over the years, to see how is that being written about, how is it being connected, how is it connected to research and practice, but also read something that's really different or new for you, so that you can take a look at what is out there now that might inform your practice. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nancy. And there's another question in the Q&A there, also from Tracy. And Gideon, this one might be for you because of your international work with the big organisations. But the question is about, in the future, does the panel have a recommendation on how to bring academics, practitioners and governments who fund public, career and employment services together? So I know you've done some work in that space internationally, and I'd invite your thoughts first.
Thanks, Mary. I think it's a very critical question. We do need to come together if we're going to make a difference. And more often than not, I find that, policy is created without touch with practitioners, and then it's, it's a huge disconnect, and many of these attempts fail. So just some thoughts that we could keep in mind when we are wanting to bring actors together is to have a strong evidence base. That's something that, where I can walk into a minister's office or a head of a department and say, look, here is the proof. Yeah, policymakers want to know that if I put in this 1 million into this, what am I going to get back? Return on investment. Very, very critical to be able to convince. So that's something, to first of all, do the groundwork. So I always try and say, do a pilot. It might be a very tiny pilot, but do it well. Let it be theoretically driven. Just a pilot up in the sky, to say that here we put some stuff together, all the children loved it, here are beautiful photographs of smiling faces. A hard-nosed policymaker is not going to look at that. Theory-driven, do a pilot, collate the evidence. Now, see, there again, if you're collating evidence, it has to be done properly. Sampling, whether it was qualitative, quantitative, just to say, I think so, and I think it's wonderful, and here are 3 children who are saying it, perhaps not. Yeah, so theory-driven, pilot, and evidence. Then you're saying, the evidence is saying that, I'm not saying it. Yeah, then it becomes far more easy to work with. That's something that I try. It's tough to bring people together.
Thanks very much, Gideon. You've given us some good ideas there. There's another question by Shannon. Shannon's directed it to Gideon, but I think I'll give each of the panel members an opportunity to answer briefly, because it resonates with something that everybody has said. In terms of, it's sort of about changing culture and first and second generational clients who face a new culture, and working with the weight of their cultural expectations and trying to fit in with a new culture. So Nancy, I might get you to start off on this one with just a quick idea, and then Gideon a quick idea, and then Wendy with a quick idea about working with first and second generational clients who are trying to meld their cultures.
Well, maybe we could each give an idea. So my idea would be, as a practitioner, and I'm coming in as the author of the culture-infused counseling perspective. So my starting point would be, as a practitioner, to really be reflective about how I'm understanding and reacting to the cultural narrative that the client is telling me, to really try to make sure that I'm being open to the perspectives and not being judgmental that one way is better. At the same time, recognizing that this can be a huge source of, the dilemma can be a huge source of pressure when people feel like it's an either or choice.
Thanks, Nancy. Gideon, a quick response?
Yeah, from a practitioner's point of view, when we come into the whole question of multicultural environments become very real now because of the porosity of borders and migration and so on and so on. Now, something that I found, the pressure point when it comes to new culture versus old culture is actually the pressure between father, mother, and child. Yeah, if you particularly with that, I mean, it varies across age groups, but I'm really interested in high school, higher secondary. So that the young person, the boy or the girl, wants to do things in the way that the proximal culture does it. Yeah, wearing cut-off jeans, for example, or jeans with holes in them, or saying that I want to be a YouTube influencer. That's my career plan. And here, daddy, who comes from India, saying, YouTube influencer, what in the world is that? Yeah. Medicine, engineering, law, that's where we want you to go. So you see, the counseling target, therefore, is not medicine, engineering, or law, or YouTube influencer, but bringing the child who's a representative of the new culture and the parents who are representatives of the older or another culture, bringing them together and bonding them together and giving them a vocabulary with which they can communicate. For me, that seems to be at the heart of the matter.
Thanks, Gideon. And a quick response from you, Wendy.
Thanks, Mary. Well, what can I say? But building on what both Nancy and Gideon have said, and Mary, you'd be surprised if I didn't talk about individual in context. And I think applying the systems theory framework to assisting the individual to understand themselves and in their contexts, and then to support their decision making within that. So for me, absolutely looking at individual in context, and the context is there are multiple layers in most people's contexts. Yeah.
Thanks, Wendy. And I'm aware of the time, and we could continue this discussion for some time, but I really need to close the webinar. So I'd really like to thank the three of you for your wonderful contribution today. It's been a real privilege to hear from you, and the comments coming through in the chat box are just fabulous. So your contributions have really been well received. We've had over 245 people in this webinar this afternoon, and we've got more who will receive it who've registered. So thank you for the three of you for a fabulous contribution to our field. Thank everybody who's joined us today. We will let you know when there are further webinars, and thank you, David, for your support behind the screen. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much, Mary, Gideon, Nancy, and David. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.